Good afternoon, friends. Uh, Welcome to our next episode of Face to Face with Racism. We're glad that you've joined us this afternoon. Our topic is this week is blaming the victim. So, without any further introduction or ado, we'll jump right in and start unpacking this uh, difficult topic. So I've asked Reverend Yvette Blair if she would start. And so Yvette, would you take a moment to introduce yourself and offer some thoughts? I'm going to step out for just a second.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to be here with you and to each of the panelists. I am Reverend Yvette Blair Lavallee. I am the daughter of Tonette, the granddaughter of Estella, the great-granddaughter of Liddy, and the great-great-granddaughter of Mariah. It is my practice to name where I come from because it helps to give context of how I got here and where I am right now. I have the honor of serving as the senior pastor at First CME Church in Dallas, located in the Oak Cliff community of Dallas. And they are a great congregation, and it is a joy in this season to be able to do so. When I think about blaming the victim, I think about my own experience. I served in the United Methodist Church for probably about 6 or 7 years, and primarily was considered a cross-racial appointment, which means an African-American person who goes to serve in a predominantly white congregation, or perhaps another person of color who goes to serve in a predominantly white congregation. So it is out of that context that I want to share my own personal experience. I served at a church, and unfortunately, it was a situation where there was a person in the membership who had a history of predatory behavior toward women. And that person enacted or exacted that predatory behavior on me. And I was told to set boundaries. And so it really became about what I needed to do in order to protect myself from this person. And the tables were really turned. It became more of protecting that person. It became more of that person, a white male, being embraced, and really leaving me to fend for myself, to say, Yvette, here are all the things that you need to be able to do to protect yourself, to set boundaries, to try to understand why this person behaves the way that they do. And when you're in a context as the only African-American person on staff, and within the history of that church, the first African-American clergy person to serve in 137 years, then it's a whole different place and space to be in. And I think it's important also to consider historically what it's like for women, particularly African-American women, who oftentimes have been considered as property, and who oftentimes have been considered as you are accessible to anybody, and that a person, particularly a white male, has the privilege and the access to, put his hands on your body, and just what that means. And so in the flurry of things, how things turned out, it really was one of those situations where I was literally made to be the bad person in that scenario, in that entire experience, constantly being sexually harassed. I'll use the term sexually assaulted because that's how it's defined in the law, is unwanted touch. When a person repeatedly comes to you and extends unwanted touch, it is considered sexual assault. And so when you're in a situation like that and you are blamed for it, then it sets a whole different precedent of, I think, how we need to start looking at this, how we need to start peeling back the layers of what it means to do blaming the victim rather than looking at the person who perpetuates the act against the person. And so I'm hoping that during this conversation, there will be opportunity to look through a different lens and to not automatically always assume that the person that has been violated has somehow done something. And then finally, I'll say I did have an opportunity to share my story in a documentary called Shatter the Silence. It debuted last year, and it's produced by Cheryl Allison and Wow Films Production. She's an amazing producer and filmmaker who's right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And that particular documentary, Shatter the Silence, is premiered across the world, all across the United States, London, Germany. And so it tells not only my story, but it lifts up the narratives of 9 other men and women, including young adults, who talk about their experiences of being blamed for something. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to be a part of this important discussion.
Well, thank you for your vulnerability and your honesty and your courage. I know this isn't the first time you've told that story, but I appreciate you telling it again. I want to lift up something really important that I heard in what you were saying, because I can already hear the voices, especially of white males, saying, but nothing in what she described was she was being blamed, right? No one was blaming her. They were just asking her to set boundaries. And I want to lift up at this point that blame is about assigning responsibility. And so if we consider that the concept of blame as who is to take responsibility for what's happening, then by asking you to set your boundaries instead of asking him, insisting that he set boundaries or take responsibility for his own actions, you were in a real sense being blamed, right?
It assumed you hadn't set boundaries.
Right. It assumed you hadn't set boundaries.
Right.
And so I think that's a real important thing. Again, I can hear my white male friends already jumping up and saying, but wait. And I want to say to you, but wait. Okay. We want to welcome Cesar, Reverend Cesar Rentie. Cesar, I'll ask you to introduce yourself just briefly, and if you want to offer some initial thoughts.
Yeah, my name is Cesar Rentie. I serve as Vice President of Pastoral Services for Methodist Health System. I've worked in healthcare now for 25 years and watched, all of the stuff that COVID-19 really impact the healthcare system. As I was thinking about this particular question about blame and the victim and all of that and the responsibility around it, and my experience, obviously there are these personal experiences that I have, but I think where I experience this more than anything is, around my colleagues when it comes to, this whole thing about, when Black Lives Matter, about protests around George Floyd's death, police brutality, all of those things. And when you see that as an African American man and you speak out against it, and then you hear these questions that come back, well, if you just follow the law or do all of these different things, it's almost saying that you have to be responsible for making sure that the police act right, that the police have to that they're responding to you when they are the supposed to be the professionals. And so when I hear this, I think where I'm always impacted, and I think where I kind of see this whole thing continue to play itself out, and is when Black men, in particular, when they protest, it is always seen as a threat. And so you can never, you know, you can, if you're white and you say, give me liberty, give me justice, or give me liberty or death, it's not seen as a threat. But if you say it as a black man, it's seen as a threat and it's heard as a threat. And I think that when you talk about blaming the victim, black men are always, I mean, I always feel within myself there's responsibility to make sure people know uh, that I'm not a threat. So I'm always working and presenting myself in that way. You know, it's interesting about COVID-19, because this is what I said about COVID-19, that COVID-19 has made all of us black. That we are now wearing masks. When we go out, we have to behave a certain way. We can't be fully present with all those around us. And it's only until we get home that we can be ourselves. Um, and that's the black experience. And we're all getting a little piece of it. I mean, it's really the experience every day of black people. When you walk out, you have to take responsibility so that you can return back home with your breath. And COVID-19 is made all of us black in some ways, because now we have to wear masks, we have to social distance. When we see someone coming towards us, we say they are a threat. We don't know who the threat is. That is the experience of blackness. And when I hear this, this taking responsibility, this thing, and the whole issue around taking responsibility. It is really about power. It's about power, and it's about the willingness to share power so that there is um, um, a just relationship, so that there's a just relationship that can exist between us. Trayvon Martin is probably the biggest, I think, is probably the one case that I when I think about it is, I mean, really speaks to this, because Trayvon Martin, regardless of what his background was, whether he was a young kid that smoked dope or whatever, the situations around his death should have placed the blame on George Zimmerman. He went to the store, he bought products with his own money. Nothing that he had was illegal. He wasn't anywhere that he wasn't supposed to be. However, he was followed in the middle of in darkness with a total stranger, and then he was asked not to fight for his life when that person approached him. And that's blaming the victim. And then when he's killed, the media, they go and stuff that is totally unrelated to Trayvon Martin in this case all comes up. I didn't know about his, smoking weed. I mean, if that's really a problem, then, I would have been in trouble a long time ago, because when I was 16, 17 years old, I experimented with weeds. I'm not any different than any of my other peers. I got in trouble. I had fights. I did all of those things, but that's what boys do. But yet he's held at a different place because he's a black man and he is seen as a threat. And he cannot fight for his life. He cannot protest against the police. You cannot kneel at the game, and you don't have a right to say or protest. This has been going on for years. I mean, if you think about it, it is the mindset that if you protest, then you are a threat. And what we're all saying, and I think what I say as an African American male, is my protesting is saying, look at my humanity. This is who I am as a human being. What I'm asking is I'm asking the person on the other side to raise their whole spiritual level awareness about who God has created them to be, because they're not wanting me to protest is really saying something about them and the distortion in how they see themselves. That they see themselves in a distorted way that is out of sync with all of creation and who God is. That they see themselves in a distorted way that is disruptive to all of life. Not just my life, but their life as well. I mean, I think about Martin Luther King's work. We're all caught in an inescapable web of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever happens to me also happens to you. And so my inability to protest is also your inability to protest. But my ability to protest is allowing me to be fully human. If you step on my toe, ouch, please get off my toe. Protest. That should be given to all of us, and we should all have the right to be able to do that and not blame the victim.
Thank you. Wow, there's a lot to process there. And let's hold that before Cynthia and Marjorie. I want to give you two a chance to introduce yourselves to us and offer any thoughts you have. Cynthia.
Thank you. I wasn't quite sure where you wanted to go.
Yeah.
My name is Cynthia Astle. I'm a member of St. Stephen United Methodist Church. I've been a professional journalist for almost 50 years. And it took me a while to place Yvette, but now I remember that when her story came out a couple of years ago at the North Texas Annual Conference, the publication that I now produce, United Methodist Insight, went to great lengths to get permission to publish her story so that we could put it before United Methodists and give them an opportunity to hear the story of someone who was blamed as a victim by the authority of the church. And so I thank Yvette for sharing that so honestly. As a professional journalist, I have seen so many instances of when victims have been blamed, and they have been people of color, they have been women, they have been economically disadvantaged people, anyone who could be considered outside the white patriarchal authority structure was often the victim who was blamed. And they were blamed because, as Caesar so clearly said, their truth was a threat. I especially appreciate Yvette's courage because I'm of a generation before her when women protested their sexual assault at great peril. I am a survivor of violent sexual assault. I kept it a secret for almost 40 years because I was told at the time of the assault that, number one, if I said anything, the person who assaulted me would kill me. And the person who assaulted me was a person in authority over me at my job. And I needed that job. I had a family to feed. And so I never said anything to anybody for 30, 34, 35 years until it got to the point where it had damaged my mental health to such an extent that I went into counseling and confronted it for the first time. In the 10 years or so since then, I have become very much aware of how often other victims are blamed.
Mm.
I am a supporter of the Time's Up organization, which provides financial support for women primarily in wage-earning jobs to be able to bring suit when they are sexually assaulted. I am also very aware as I go about my work. Right now, for the last 30 years or so, I've specialized in reporting on the United Methodist Church. And so in that sense, I guess you could say I'm woke because I'm always on the alert for a situation in which I or some other journalist may be asking those kinds of questions that Caesar referred to that are blaming the victim. It is the experience of being victimized in that way and not feeling that you can safely and honestly express what has happened to you is about the worst feeling I have ever had in my entire life. When I hear Black folks especially talk about what their life is like and how much they have to be on guard when they go out. I have Black women friends who, if we were to go shopping, they would be followed by security all around the store. I have a Black friend who operates his own business and drives a BMW, and he's been stopped 4 different times, DWB, driving while Black. And so blaming the victim, from my perspective, is a tool of the authority that's used to subjugate those who are a threat. It has been a very long road for me. I think probably the scariest thing I've done so far was when Brett Kavanaugh was being considered for the Supreme Court. I went with another group of women to Senator John Cornyn's office up in Plano, and we told his assistant our stories, and that was the first time I had ever publicly said anything, and it scared me so bad I had a panic attack right there in the middle of the lobby. Fortunately, there was a woman there who counsels people who have been sexually assaulted, and she was there to kind of get me over the hump. But it's that kind of it leaves a scar on your psyche. It leaves a scar on your soul that is always there. It heals to a certain extent. It really does. But there are times that just, rip that scar open and it bleeds all over again. And when you think about how many people suffer that same experience, whether they're women who've been assaulted, men who've been assaulted, children who've been assaulted, people of color, it really gives you a perspective on, well, it's no wonder we have such a hard time creating a beloved community when so many people are walking around so badly hurt. And with that, I'll throw the ball to Marjorie.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for your courage and vulnerability. Marjorie.
My name's Marjorie Procter-Smith. Guess I should have put my whole name up there when I signed in. I am a retired professor from Perkins School of Theology. I taught worship for a long time at Perkins. I'm now retired. The subject, one of the topics that I did a lot of research and writing on was sexual and domestic violence against women and children, particularly. A lot of that work was academic, but several years ago I served on a jury, and it was a child sexual abuse case. I don't know if I can talk about it. It was continuous child sexual abuse by the child's father. And the thing that came to me when I was thinking about this topic is the tendency of the jurors. We spent 3 days in the jury room hashing this out. The tendency of the jurors to blame the child.
Yeah.
You say it out loud, do you think, how can that be? The abuse started when she was a toddler. But the jurors did not want to blame the father. And some very extraordinary arguments were brought up. Most often, kids get mad at their parents and they make up stuff. Not that stuff. It was really, being on the jury itself was very traumatic. I'm happy to say that we convicted him. I'm unhappy to say that it was the second trial. The first trial ended in a hung jury. So this child, she was probably 11, 12 at the time of this trial, but the earlier trial, she would have been even younger. She had to testify on the stand. So blaming the victim is, this is a prime example, and blaming the victim is often called the second victimization. And I certainly saw it in operation here. And although we convicted her father, that's not a good outcome. It was the necessary outcome, but it's not a good outcome for a child who was already estranged from not only her father, but her aunt and uncle who testified on her father's behalf, from her brother who blamed her for breaking up the family. Only her mother stood by her, and even that not at the beginning. At first, she too blamed the child. So this notion of blaming the victim and this second victimization is so deeply hardwired into our racist, patriarchal social structures that it's just almost a knee-jerk reaction. People almost don't have to think about it. And I think about this every time I read the news stories that Cesar and Cynthia mentioned about police brutality and violence, particularly against African-American citizens, where the first reaction is, what did they do wrong? What did this person who's shot dead or strangled to death or choked to death or shot in their own bed, what did they do wrong? Not what did the person in authority do wrong? What did that child do wrong? Not what did that father do wrong? What did Yvette do wrong? Not what did her attacker do wrong? And it's just such a classic means of deflecting attention away from the perpetrator and absolving them of responsibility. And I'm not saying anything anybody else hasn't already said, but I guess I just want to second all of those observations and say that has certainly, I have certainly seen that played out, not just in this jury trial, but like all of you, over and over and over again. It's going to be very hard to eradicate this, I guess is my point.
So, thank you, Marjorie, Cynthia, Yvette, Caesar, all of you. I am I'm reminded by this red box in the corner of my screen about the time. And I'm reminded that last week when we talked about weaponizing whiteness, that one of the things white people like to weaponize is the clock. As a pastor, this happens a lot to you if you don't get a 59-minute service. You know, the clock gets weaponized against you. So I don't want to weaponize the clock against us because these are very tender and fragile places that we that you all have taken us in. But I do want to honor time, others' time, and your time. Are there any thoughts that anyone has in response to what they've heard? Some responses or reactions, comments you want to offer? We'll have a chance to talk again and unpack some more, but just in this time, I want to make sure everyone has a chance to say.
Well, I want to thank Cesar for his comparison to the COVID pandemic making us all black, at least a little bit. That sort of flipped a light bulb for me because I think that that may be one of the pieces behind the people who resist wearing a mask, even though it's, you know, a good public health practice. I suspect that there's a little bit of knee-jerk reaction in there that they don't want to give up that position of supremacy because they've been told they have to do this. That really helped me understand. I've been shaking my head at why would you not do that when it's now been proven that helps to stop the spread of the disease. And so thank you, Cesar, because that helps me understand that perspective a little better.
And I should clarify, because I'm particularly sensitive about names, since I like my name a certain way and not other ways. Caesar says Caesar, not Cesar. That's my
okay.
No,
I
introduced him that way. It's my fault. I need to retrain myself, so I'll own that one. Yeah. Anybody else? I don't want to cut anybody off.
Well, you know, I think that this whole question, you know, I mean, I think it's a really big question, and I think it's an important question for the church because I think COVID-19 offers us a real opportunity to evaluate who God is calling us to be. And you know, while I believe that it's important that, you know, there are laws and policies that are in place, what I also think is really, really important is that the church has the right language and the right theology to deal with this. Because when you look at the institution of slavery, it is propped up. I mean, mainly the genesis of it, the real start of slavery is propped up by a theological perspective that is out there. And I think that if we're going to deal with this, I think we have to really talk about what does it mean for us as a church to not say something, to blame the victim, Can we really call ourselves a loving community? Can we say that we're following the tenets of Christ when Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and then love your neighbor as yourself? Are we really living up to that? If we don't, if we don't have the right language, and if we can't talk about this as sin, because I mean, I think we have to talk about it like that. I mean, I think it's got to be personal to us. I mean, I think James Cone says it best. What does the gospel have to do with me? Well, everybody wants the gospel to save them, but no one wants the gospel to condemn them to hell. I just think we need to have some discussion about what does it mean to be in loving community with each other and to have a theology that really speaks to that. And it's the role of the church. It's the role of the church. I think we have spent so much of our time on materialistic things. We have spent so much of our time on materialistic things that we have failed to talk about the spiritual matters of life. And not in the sentimental use of that word, but the spiritual sense of that word, that it is a love that seeks for all of us creative, redemptive goodwill, that it is a love that is seeking for us, as Dr. Martin Luther King says, a love that seeks for us creative, redemptive goodwill, that it is a love that is always calling us as a church to risk, to enter into the place that is different than our own experience. It's Jesus going into the place where they're raising pigs. I mean, it's a rabbi who is at the well and with a woman who is living on the outskirts of society. It's Jesus allowing himself to be vulnerable and to be touched by a woman who is considered unclean. And yet he says to her in Liberation, that's the kind of risk. And I think that's the kind of language that we have to begin talking about. And we have to wrap our worship and everything that we do around that. I think that's I think that's what COVID-19 provides for us. It provides us that opportunity to do that.
You point us in a really good direction. I think that Caesar. So Teddy Fullenwider asked, what are some things that we can say in conversation to redirect it when someone starts blaming the victim to distract from the issue at hand? Now, I tell everybody that when we step into this space, we're never going to tie up anything with a bow neatly. Our goal here is to do some excavating, and we've certainly done that today. So we're not going to be able to answer Teddy's question, but I don't want it to go unheard. So I think one thing I want to say to Teddy before we sign off is the most important thing you can do is call it out. Mm-hmm. Because even though people may be aware of the concept of blaming the victim, they're not conscious of when they're doing it, right? So like Yvette, they don't think they're blaming the victim, but by forcing her to take responsibility for setting boundaries, that is an equivalent. And so we need to call it out, first of all. And I think that's the very first fundamental thing. I mean, be loving, be kind, but be firm, and be honest. Step into, Eddie, I know you're a 2, so step into the high side of 8 and call it out. The second thing I think that's important for us to remember that Caesar was pointing us to is that for Christians, the very premise of God's reconciling work in Jesus Christ is not blaming the victim. Right? The psalmist says, oh God, if you were to count iniquities, who could stand? Right?
Mhm.
None of us.
Mhm.
But it's God who steps into the breach and says, I'm not going to hold you responsible for all that crap that happened at any time, but I'm going to embrace you as one who is loved. And so for us as the church to start holding iniquities, presumably against people, and saying, well, they're responsible for this part, they got to fix that before we'll see them as equals. Uh, that's just not even, that's a non-starter. That should be a non-starter for anyone in a Christian context. And certainly anyone who ascribes to a theory of atonement. I won't go down that road right now.
We don't have time.
Uh,
We've covered a lot of things today, actually, and a lot of difficult things. I think for anyone who has suffered any sort of abuse or has been in the shoes where they've been a victim that has been blamed or been expected to carry some responsibility, there's some processing to be done there. But then also, as Jeffrey was pointing out at the beginning, some of us white folks might be having a hard time thinking that we do this. But I really appreciated Marjorie said, it's a natural thing. It is a natural thing for us to go to a disbelief that somebody in authority or somebody in a care position or somebody that we admire or look up to would do something as atrocious as abuse or as any sort of racist act. So we have to be cognizant of those things. And so now that we've talked about it, you're going to be more aware of it and you're going to see it come up in your life. And so as that happens, take care. Be conscious and give yourself grace, and but lean into it. And as Reverend Dr. Michael Waters has told us over and over again on Facebook, don't take your foot off the gas. We are glad that you were here with us this week. Next week's topic is spiritual bypassing. If you want to know what that is before we get started, Google. It's a great place because I had to do that. And we look forward to seeing you then. And we're going to go to the backstage, and there will be more to come on Tuesday. Take care.